Our next presenter is Dr. Ramona Coelho. Dr. Coelho is a family physician in London, Ontario, whose practice largely cares for marginalized persons. She is a senior fellow with the MacDonald Laurier Institute, and she has testified before Parliament and has been published in newspapers and journals laying out the dangers of legal euthanasia. So, Dr. Coelho, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just take a second to figure out how to
Yeah, of course.
share this slideshow properly. There we go. Does that work, everyone?
Yeah, that looks great.
So thank you very much, Zoe. Thank you, David, for also inviting me to present with you. Yes, I am a fan of London, Ontario. I originally come from Montreal, where I used to do home care primarily as my focus of care for people with severe disabilities or dementia, people who had mental health struggles with addictions. In London, I also take care of patients who find themselves often on the margins, people who have been in prison or face charges. I take care of a lot of refugees, and I also take care of a lot of patients with disabilities and mental health struggles. I take care of a lot of patients with chronic pain. I just like to start by saying that, as Canadians, we often see ourselves as a sensible, thoughtful, and kind society. But I think that this presentation will highlight how I believe Canada has failed to protect the lives of people with disabilities in its MAiD policies. Just quickly, if you want to read, so Dave and I both sit on the MAiD Death Review Committee, and our first reports came out in October. If people are interested, I guess we could send copies of that after this presentation. There's some published articles that go into much more depth. I wrote this article on the right. And Dave and Dr. Yara Kodalek have a book on critical or key multidisciplinary perspectives of MAiD. And I and Dr. Gained and Professor Lemons have a book coming out too. So lots of reading material if people are interested.
Ramona, if I could just step in for 1 second. A couple
Sure.
people were just wondering if you might be able to speak just a little bit louder.
I will try.
Thank
I
you.
will try. Okay. And please feel free to keep telling me that because my voice does tend to drop off. I'm sorry. Okay. So, in terms of my first slide, I just want to highlight that assisted dying is very different from most medicine. So MAiD criteria, as David just laid out, is based on criminal code exemptions to the crimes of homicide and assisted suicide. Medical care is usually driven by medical research and evidence-based findings of safety and harms to individuals and the population. And when MAiD is offered by doctors or nurse practitioners, is not actually left to medical kind of professional judgments, apparently. It is rather prescribed by Canada's criminal code. So very different from medicine. Medical care and procedures are performed to save or improve the quality of life, to accompany and heal patients. This is an extraordinary to the ethical focus of medicine, and it has been inserted by legislation into the heart of medicine. I invite everyone to read, if you're interested, what I consider to be a very good article on this by Dr. Harvey Chachinov and Joseph Fiennes called "Is MAiD Part of Palliative Care?" It was published in JAMA, I think, last month or the month before, but it lays out the principles of what is medicine and palliative care and tries to show that, there are some things that don't quite fit. And I think that the article also greatly explains why MAiD doesn't really jive with medicine at all, why it really is an exception to everything else that we're taught and learn to do. Just to take us back to when this journey started, not exactly when it started, as David talked about the courts, but when you talk about Quebec moving forward its discussion of of having medical aid in dying. The initial discourse was that this would be a very exceptional procedure, that the quality of palliative care would be a legal and clinical safeguard throughout this province, that there would be a prediction of 100 requests in the first year by Gaëtan Barré, who at the time was part of this. And you can see that a shift has come very quickly, where the safeguards that were initially laid out are now being called by some as barriers to access. An exceptional measure is now talking about choice. Selection criteria is being labeled by people who want broader access as discrimination. And all based on a very human experience of suffering, which is not further defined in the legislation. We have 10,000 deaths in 2021 by assisted dying, 13,200 in 2022. Provincial tallies have come in, so it looks like we're at 15,300 deaths for 2023. We're expecting the MAiD death report either in November or December. Quebec has just recently released their end-of-life commission report, and they have specified that the rate is 7.3% of deaths are MAiD, and that they cannot assess the quality of palliative care that was administered beforehand. Now think back to those first quotes that palliative care would be first of all presented as a safeguard, that there would be less than 100 requests a year. In Ontario, where I'm presenting from, the coroner stats that were released in July show that there's over 400 cases a month, and Ontario's average timeline to connect to MAiD services is 2.2 days. It's in that public coroner's report. I'd like to move to some cases. I'm presenting some cases today of families that I know, and I have asked them to share some of their thoughts. So for Donna Duncan, Donna died from MAiD, and her daughters Christy and Alicia have really tried to raise awareness about how she died. Alicia was in Better Off Dead, that starred Liz Carr recently, that BBC documentary. And I'm going to read what Alicia sent me tonight, or what I asked her I could quote tonight. Actually, it's more accurate. My mother's story is one of a life cut short, not by terminal illness, but by a broken system that failed to protect her and then refused to reveal how or why. Donna Duncan was never fully diagnosed or treated for her mental health and physical health issues. Despite this, she was granted access to MAiD without a comprehensive exploration of alternative support, such as palliative care, counseling, or assessments that might have identified a treatable condition. This alone raised enough questions to prompt Canada's first investigation into a MAiD case. But in an alarming display of a lack of transparency, the investigation was shut down when health authorities refused to release my mom's MAiD assessment records to the police. When even law enforcement cannot access the information that led to my mother's death, how can any family trust in the safeguards of this system? This opacity shows that the safeguards are too often a thin veil, leaving families like mine grappling with unanswered questions and a sense of betrayal. I invite everyone who's interested. I've posted Alicia's web address there, www.aliciaduncan.com. And so please feel free. Alicia is writing a book, and I encourage you to follow her. Alan Nichols, this is before the expansion of MAiD. He had recurrent episodes of depression. He had several disabilities. During a bout of depression, a neighbor called the RCMP for a wellness check, and he was admitted involuntarily under the Mental Health Act. He had a longer admission, and during that time, he received euthanasia to the utter dismay of his family, who have to live with the fact that he asked them to come home, but they thought he was safest in hospital because they thought that they would protect his life. So Gary and Tricia said, "We are still bearing our loss, and we miss him especially during holidays. We are grateful to those who have spoken up against current MAiD policies not being enforced in Canada. The federal government hasn't the means to review each case province to province from application to procedure. There are no safeguards to protect our loved ones from a questionable application, nor to postpone a death by MAiD until such questions are answered. Our government is supposed to protect and shelter its citizens. They have failed in Alan's case. I also will add that I am honored that I am sharing this with you tonight. It gives me comfort and support." Despite there being families who have been searching for answers, like the Duncan sisters, like Gary and Trish, who've written 40 letters to different authorities and professional bodies, they have no answers. They don't know why their family member died. They are left with no closure, and this caused them a lot of trauma. And yet there is no place for recourse before or after MAiD is completed. And I think Minister Lametti had said when he was the Justice Minister, well, people can seek the courts or things that were very, very hard for families to actually do in real time. Also, a case of a patient in my region, but a gentleman who had a small stroke and was predicted to be able to eat normally again and regain most of his balance. He was sad, isolated in hospital. He'd been diagnosed with an adjustment disorder. So he's in this acute phase of isolation. His mood is down. He does request MAiD. He has no terminal diagnosis, but because he was learning to eat again, the MAiD providers decided he was track 1 eligible, because if he continued to eat that way, his death would be reasonably foreseeable. In fact, he had eaten everything that a dietary had sent him, like about 1,300 calories a day. He had not choked or aspirated. The treating team did not feel that he was near death. And yet he received MAiD very quickly. I think 1 week later, he received medical assistance in dying. I think that I would like to just, David already talked about how physicians perceive the quality of life of people with disabilities as lower, and patients with disabilities, if they have their needs met, rate their quality of life as high, often the same as aged matched healthy individuals. So it just kind of shows the bias of physicians. And I think that this case could reflect, well, to me, it does reflect ableism, as David also spoke about. Ableism, like sexism, like racism, and other forms of cultural and social oppression, is a deeply embedded value system that subjugates disabled states of being by asserting the superiority of non-disabled states. This could be unconscious or conscious. So when people say, as they have in the media, that MAiD for solely psychosocial suffering, such as poverty, is forbidden, but also say that if the main source of suffering, psychosocial suffering, and the person has a disability, then that is legislatively allowed. For me, that speaks to a discriminatory policy that has been created from an ableist perspective. This just shows that the other part of this is that people with, like this gentleman who had a stroke, people have new injuries and illnesses. Yes, they are very suicidal, and they can be suicidal for a while. And I didn't do this slide very well, but these two slides are the Canadian ones in this diagonal. And they show that patients themselves, their own perspectives, um, is that they would not have been able to make informed consent to die because they would not have understood what it was like to recover and live with their disability. So I would say that ending someone's life in a time of known transition, of recovery, is a medical error and a lack of medical knowledge, as well as a policy perpetuated by ableism. Um, this this patient is alive and she's my patient. She allowed me to talk about this story, but she watched CTV. They ran a provision of a gentleman's euthanasia. And she watched it and she came to see me like the Monday after it aired to let me know that euthanasia would be good for her. She is in her midlife. She has a spinal cord injury. Um, she has been told, she has let me know that she's reached out to a MAiD provider. I think it was she was taking someone else for a MAiD assessment. They told her she would qualify when she was ready to come back. In the meantime, I'm trying to help this lady recover, adjust. And in the midst of all of this, the government has refused her disability benefits. And me, the neurologist, everyone is very surprised, but we're trying to appeal this. But can you imagine the burden on somebody who is terrified of poverty, terrified of dying, has heard that this is a great experience because it's been shown that way? How those kinds of things can, those kinds of messages can impact choice. And that's the next slide that I wanted to show, is that we know from suicide prevention research that messaging in general affects our choices. So when Robin Williams committed suicide, suicide rates went up in Canada. And likewise, and I have heard this from sharing with many Indigenous communities, that when someone commits suicide in their community, you can have a string of suicides that follow in the days to come and weeks because of the discouragement and the despair that kind of sets in the community. The literature shows that increased access to lethal means, coupled with messaging, can affect vulnerable people. The Canadian Association of Suicide Prevention has a very good document on this when they talk about the potential overlap between medical assistance in dying and suicide in our broad legislation, especially outside the end-of-life context. And I'm just going to quote, I'm going to kind of like shorten, abbreviate parts of their document. It's a longer document. It is a very worthwhile read. It is imperative that Canadians invest in the funding of ways to alleviate suffering and support people in connecting to a life worth living. MAiD for those not at the end of life carries the inherent assumption that some lives are not worth living. Suicide messaging and contagion. There is a large literature demonstrating that both suicide and coping seeking are contagious. So suicide messaging and coping seeking are contagious messaging either way. Sending a message that sometimes death is the best remedy for a painful life is likely to subvert suicide prevention messaging, one of the few population level interventions known to decrease suicide rates. And the last point I'll say is the shifting norms that have the potential to create social pressures or a so-called duty to die for people with chronic illnesses who may seek death to alleviate the burden they feel they're causing others. Such a norm is again in conflict with suicide prevention, which to help people to challenge their thoughts and reject thoughts that they are a burden in favor of efforts to see that they have a positive role in this world. I won't share the name of this gentleman, but also I am going to read a quote from the family member. I just will. So this gentleman is a 71-year-old male who was admitted to the hospital for falls. He caught a contagious infectious diarrheal illness while he was on the ward. He was also isolated from his family because of COVID. And actually, he was humiliated. He felt that he was humiliated by the staff. He would say that because of this, the diarrhea, that he would hear people making comments, people would open the window wildly and sigh. He would have to go to the bathroom and be in the bathroom, and they would take his food tray so that he'd miss meals. And he was having not a great time in this hospital. He developed shortness of breath, and a hospital team member mentioned to him that euthanasia was an option for him, that he would qualify. The euthanasia procedure was booked with the hospital team before his second assessment, and within 48 hours of his first assessment, he was dead. His family feels unforeseen delays in admission might have led, like in his admission, like being on the hospital ward too long might have led to the suggestion. That is their speculation. But they also are concerned, as knowing their father, that he accepted it because of how badly he was made to feel while he was on that hospital ward. And actually, his second assessor, and I have heard the tape of the conversation of the second assessment, couldn't actually assess his wishes to have MAiD or not. Kept referring to the family to ask them what he would have thought, told the family that they would just use the first assessment. So that family says, I would say that this ordeal has been very traumatic for my family. Not everyone got to say goodbye, and it wasn't peaceful and didn't happen as it was described to us. His lack of consent is something that we live with and constantly think about. Okay. So I think that David has touched on this, basically that it's easier, as he said, it's easier to access MAiD than health services. The way that our health services system has been set up, the things that are just inaccessible to people, or wait times are inordinately long while people get sicker, is first of all not acceptable even of itself. But then when you add the potential option to end your life suffering, that can put an extraordinary pressure on patients who are desperate. So I would say that, we talk about MAiD and it being compassionate and about being choice, but actually when you have no choices, when you are living in poverty, when your needs are not met, when you're not able to engage with community because things are not accessible, then isn't it actually structural coercion to die, which is the opposite of choice? It is the opposite of autonomy, and I would say it's the opposite of compassion. It is kind of the worst remedy you could offer for someone who's lacking services. And this is just a quote that our former federal disability inclusion cabinet minister said, "It's easier to access MAiD than to get a wheelchair in some parts of this country." I'm not sure actually if this slide is still up. It was, and I'll have to check after this show, after this presentation, but Dying with Dignity has a myths and facts page. And here they say, fact, suffering from a lack of social supports does not qualify a person for MAiD. No one can receive MAiD on the basis of inadequate housing, disability supports, or home care. Well, okay, that is true, but it kind of hides the fact that you have to have a disability diagnosis to make it in through the MAiD legislation. So you're right, you cannot access MAiD for inadequate housing, et cetera, unless you're MAiD. And I'm not saying all MAiD assessors and providers would do this. I think that there's a lot of MAiD assessors and providers who would not do this. But there are some MAiD assessors and providers who have done this. They have, on the basis of psychosocial suffering, approved people because they have a disability. And, from initial kind of denial that this is even happening, we've heard in Parliament over and over again that these are false cases. We're all, not credible witnesses. All the MAiD providers are credible witnesses who are saying this has never happened. Even until, recently, I'm still having debates in parliaments where people are saying this is a lie, this is not happening. You have people like Wieben Mullen, who published in the Journal of Medical Ethics, not denying it's happening, but actually arguing that it's still a good, so that MAiD for psychosocial suffering with a disability is happening, but they defend it that it's still better than no choice to die, all in the name of autonomy and harm reduction. Yet harm reduction strategies are meant to save lives and to prevent death, not to facilitate it. And people who have no choice but the choice to die are basically being ushered to death, which is, again, not an exercise of autonomy. Last year, the End of Life Commission, I already talked about what they just released about very briefly, but Michel Bureau, I understand he's retired or about to retire. The doctor sent a memo to Quebec doctors reminding them to respect the law. He's seeing a slight increase in non-compliance with the law of MAiD procedures. He said, doctor shopping is not for a favorable opinion is not acceptable. That it is not a formality that you just find your friend as your second assessor or your colleague to get that second assessment so that you can go ahead and do MAiD. This is a real independent safeguard that is meant to form as a formal assessment to see if a patient actually qualifies. And he also said that advanced age is not a criteria for MAiD eligibility. In 2018, the Officer of the Chief Coroner of Ontario had already noted in documents that went out to all healthcare providers that there were some issues with compliance with both the criminal code and the regulatory body. And so just fast forward to now, David and I both sit on the MAiD Death Review Committee with our confreres. They're of different backgrounds. There are 16 of us. And our first report came out in October of 2024. And he set up this kind of panel of varied expertise to kind of weigh in. He already has a MAiD review team that looks through and based on the different types of cases, assesses things for concerns about vulnerability or undue influence. They call it voluntariness, or I would call that coercion. But they actually, I think, have done a great job. They have identified, I understand from a recent article, over 428 issues. I don't know of what degree, but of non-compliance with the law or practice standards. So I'm just going to share. I'm just going to share 2 of the 6 cases in the. I'm wondering if I should share cases, but I think I'll just very quickly share 2 of the 6 cases. I think they're worth reading in their entirety in the 2 reports. Actually, it's called Report 2 and Report 3. Each report has 3 cases, and there's some trends, and then there's a discussion and some recommendations. But the 2 cases I will highlight just because I want to highlight the medical things that I am concerned about. So I'll call him Mr. A, is a male in his 40s who experienced a lot of suffering and decline following his mandated COVID vaccines. He was admitted twice to the hospital for mental health issues and suicidal ideation during his journey. And he was still given MAiD on the basis of the providers opined that he had like a COVID vaccine reaction. However, in terms of like a post-mortem like analysis of the situation with experts, is concluded, and I think an autopsy was done. It was concluded that actually it was more likely to be a mental health struggle that was leading to a lot of physical symptoms. So he wouldn't have even met the criteria of the law if the MAiD providers had considered it in that fashion. But what I would say is that, for COVID, long COVID, for COVID vaccines, all these things are relatively newer in the timeline of medicine or in the time of our society. And we're learning a lot. And I would say that, in my personal opinion, ending someone's life prematurely in a very short period of time from a COVID vaccine reaction doesn't smack me as very prudent. Like, I would have thought this was a case that should have been paused, and there should have been a lot more care and accompaniment that I felt went in. And the other cases that Report 2 are mostly about people with largely mental health drivers of suffering, but they were granted MAiD on the basis of disability. In terms of the second case that I'll talk about, I think I just threw it on the floor. Sorry. Yeah, I think I wanted to share about the gentleman who had an injury. And again, like I had highlighted in those articles, in a time of known higher suicidality, in a time of transition, worried about not seeing his children again, um, he received medical assistance in dying. And in that case report, it's documented that the MAiD assessors, both of them felt that he was track 2, so he was not dying. But they did one of them did document that, you know, if he refused care, he could make himself sick enough to become track 1. And that kind of scares me, that kind of purposely circumventing the law, you know, trying to, like, suggesting to that man if he didn't eat, or letting this person know that if he refuses care, he can die faster, can be an incentivization of death, when really that person should still be primarily encouraged to seek supports, and that we should be trying to help them. Okay. Very quickly, because I think I have overspoken my time, I will just say that the trends in the report concern me. Yes, people who choose MAiD who are not dying come largely more from poorer places. In general, if you look at what was offered to relieve suffering, you can see that things that are actually very important to alleviate suffering for a lot of people with disabilities have not really been addressed, like community services, housing, income, pittance, and counseling, mental health, disability supports, 40%. And largely medicine-driven, like a pharmacological approach, which is a very non-holistic way to address a person's suffering in general. And that's concerning to me. In terms of those who are not dying, they also are younger than track 1 individuals, which some of these things are understandable because MAiD has been given, like the people that we think it's compassionate to end their lives are often people who unfortunately are also marginalized. So ageism, ableism, and because of our legislation being brought open, people who have more suffering are going to be people who have psychosocial suffering, which is disturbing to me. In terms of women being higher rates of access for women accessing the system than men for track 2, women experience a higher level of violence, of poverty, of lack of accommodation to work. All of these things are greatly concerning to me, reflected in these numbers, because women who have had, for example, intimate violence are 6 times more likely to try to commit suicide. And again, I'm talking about that Canadian Association of Suicide Prevention, that overlap that is concerning about MAiD and suicide, and that we could be offering women who we have traumatized a way to end their life instead of suicide prevention and resources to live. Very quickly, sorry. People who are not dying were less likely to mention a next of kin. They were more likely to mention like a lawyer or a healthcare provider or a friend, which shows like a smaller circle of support potentially. And, you know, David and I, when we first looked at these stats, we noticed that Thunder Bay, which is a high level of social deprivation, of addictions, has one of the higher levels of track 2 MAiD. I think, for the interest of time, I should I'm just going to talk. Okay, just very quickly, I have to highlight this article by Gabrielle Peters. So I think there have been impacts to conscientious rights, which I will skip today. I think that there's definitely a lot of pressure on healthcare settings to incorporate MAiD into services. So in Quebec, all institutions in palliative care, hospices, to continue to receive funding, they must do MAiD. Delta Hospice lost its building that they fundraised because they refused to do MAiD on their premise, even though the neighboring building was the hospital. Strong lobbies are pushing for access to MAiD in Catholic hospitals. Dying with Dignity has planned in many transparent, open videos that I have seen, planning a court case where to do it strategically, and they chose St. Paul's. Um, and Gabrielle Peters' article in Policy Options, I think is really worth reading. That reality, not religion, is the reason people need MAiD-free healthcare. That MAiD does infringe on the safety and rights of people with disabilities, hence the disability court case that has been launched. I think it's worth reading that article, and hopefully Zoe can send it to people who ask after. And then I'll just end by, and I think David framed it very nicely legislatively, like this legislation is pretty broad, and physicians and clinicians, nurse practitioners have been given a huge responsibility, not a lot of direction. And I am concerned that given the overlap of suicide and MAiD, that some people will be given suicide prevention because they have people to advocate for them. They have people who know how to access the system, and that other people will not, that they will be given assisted suicide, and they will, that their own feeling that their life is not worth living will be confirmed by someone. And ultimately, like, this is not a knock on doctors who do MAiD, but really what you are saying, or like what you are acting out, is that it is better for that person to be dead than to be alive. And to me, in medicine, I don't feel that this is compatible with medicine. I agree. I like Harvey Chachanov's article 100%. Everyone should read it. And I think that's one of the big problems with MAiD. Thank you.